The winter of 1941 arrived early in Ray County, Missouri. By mid-November, the farmlands had already surrendered to a brutal cold that crept through barn walls and froze the morning dew into delicate sheets of glass across the fields. The war in Europe cast a long shadow over America, even in places as remote as this, small farming communities where neighbors lived miles apart, where secrets could be buried as easily as seeds, and where the only witnesses were the crows that circled overhead like black omens. It was the kind of cold that made bones ache, the kind that forced farmers to break ice on water troughs twice a day just to keep their livestock alive. And it was in this cold, on a gray December morning, that someone first noticed the Haney children were gone. The Haney farm sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. It wasn't much to look at. A sagging 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a pig pen that seemed to grow larger every year. Ray Haney had owned the property for nearly 15 years, ever since he'd moved his family down from Iowa in the late 20s. He was known in town as a hard man, the kind who kept to himself and expected others to do the same. 47 years old, with shoulders like an ox and hands calloused from years of farm work, Ray Haney wasn't the type people approached for friendly conversation. His face was weathered and deeply lined, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that rarely showed emotion. He wore the same oil-stained overalls nearly every day, and he smelled of tobacco and livestock, a scent that clung to him like a second skin. His wife, Bonnie, had died 3 years earlier. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though there were whispers in town that suggested something darker. She'd been a small, timid woman who rarely came into town, and when she did, she kept her eyes down and her words few. Some of the church ladies remembered bruises on her arms. Others recalled how she'd flinch when Ray raised his voice. But in 1941, in a place like Ray County, such things were considered family business. You didn't ask questions. You didn't interfere. After Bonnie died, Ray was left to raise their 4 children alone. Betty, age 16, Lorene, 14, Ray Jr., 12, and little James, just 8 years old. The children were as quiet as their mother had been. Betty, the eldest, had inherited her mother's delicate features and nervous disposition. She had dark hair that she wore in a simple braid, and eyes that seemed too old for her age. Haunted, some would later say. She'd dropped out of school after her mother's death to help care for the younger ones and manage the household. Neighbors who'd seen her at the general store noticed how thin she'd become, how her dresses hung loose on her frame. Lorene was different, tougher, more defiant. She had her father's square jaw and stubborn streak. The school teacher, Mrs. Pemberton, remembered Lorene as a bright student who asked too many questions and didn't back down easily. She had freckles across her nose and wore her reddish-brown hair short, like a boy's. Some of the other students teased her for it, but Lorene never seemed to care what anyone thought. Ray Jr. was a shadow of his father in miniature, quiet, serious, with the same pale eyes and heavy build. He'd stopped talking much after his mother died. The other boys at school said he'd changed, that he'd become withdrawn and would stare at people with an unsettling intensity. He spent most of his time working alongside his father on the farm, learning the hard labor that came with running the property. And then there was James, the baby. 8 years old, with his mother's soft features and a gap between his front teeth. He was the only one who still smiled occasionally, though even that had become rare. He had a habit of humming to himself, old hymns his mother used to sing, and he was terrified of the dark. Every night he'd beg Betty to leave a lamp burning in the room he shared with Ray Jr. It was December 15, 1941, exactly 1 week after Pearl Harbor, when Martha Henderson made the drive out to the Haney farm. Martha was a stout woman in her 50s who served on the school board and took her civic duties seriously. When children stopped attending school without explanation, Martha Henderson noticed. The Haney children hadn't been to school in over 3 weeks. At first, Mrs. Pemberton, the teacher, assumed they were helping with farm work during the difficult season. It wasn't uncommon for children in Ray County to miss school during harvest, or when livestock needed tending. But 3 weeks was unusual, even for a family as isolated as the Haneys. Martha's Model A. Ford rattled down the frozen dirt road, its tires crunching over patches of ice. The December sky hung low and gray, threatening snow. The bare trees on either side of the road looked like skeletal hands reaching toward the heavens. Everything was silent, except for the labored sound of the engine and the occasional cry of a crow. As she approached the property, Martha felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The farmhouse looked abandoned, no smoke rising from the chimney despite the bitter cold, no lights in the windows, no signs of life. But as she pulled closer to the barn, she noticed movement. Ray Haney was there, standing near the pig pen, a shovel in his hands. He didn't look up when she arrived. Martha cut the engine and stepped out, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The smell hit her immediately, stronger than usual, even for a pig farm. Something sharp and unpleasant that made her stomach turn. "Mr. Haney," she called out, forcing cheer into her voice. "Cold morning, isn't it?" Ray finally turned. His face was expressionless, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to get back in her car. He didn't respond to her greeting. "I've come about the children," Martha continued, walking carefully across the frozen ground. "Mrs. Pemberton is concerned. They haven't been to school in quite some time." "Are they ill?" A long pause. The wind picked up, carrying that strange smell again. Martha noticed the pigs were unusually active, grunting and moving restlessly in their pen. "Gone," Ray said finally. His voice was flat, emotionless. Martha blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The children. They're gone." "Gone where, Mr. Haney?" Another pause. Ray's knuckles were white around the handle of the shovel. "To stay with relatives, down in Oklahoma, Bonnie's sister. Too hard to manage them all by myself during winter." It was a reasonable explanation. But something about the way he said it, the complete lack of emotion, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, made Martha's skin crawl. "All 4 of them?" she pressed. "Even little James?" "All 4. That's quite sudden. When did they leave?" 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. He turned away from her, back toward the pig pen. "Need to finish my work, Mrs. Henderson." Martha stood there for a moment, uncertain. She looked toward the farmhouse again. One of the upstairs windows was broken, a piece of cloth stuffed into the opening. The front porch sagged dangerously, and that smell, that terrible smell that seemed to grow stronger the longer she stood there. "Mr. Haney, if you need any assistance, if you need help contacting the children or don't need anything." He didn't turn around this time. "You can go now." It wasn't a suggestion. Martha Henderson drove back to town with her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She told herself she was being foolish, letting her imagination run wild. Ray Haney was an unpleasant man, certainly, but that didn't mean anything sinister had occurred. Children went to stay with relatives all the time. It made sense that a widower struggling to manage a farm alone might send his children elsewhere during the harsh winter months. But that night, lying in bed beside her sleeping husband, Martha couldn't shake the image of Ray Haney standing by that pig pen, shovel in hand, with those dead eyes staring at nothing. And that smell. That god-awful smell. She wasn't the only one with suspicions. At the general store 3 days later, Ruth Calder, who lived on the adjacent property to the Haneys, mentioned to the grocer that she'd heard screaming coming from the Haney farm back in November. High-pitched screaming that went on for hours and then suddenly stopped. She'd assumed it was the pigs at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. It didn't sound like pigs. It sounded like something else entirely. The grocer mentioned it to the postman. The postman mentioned it to the sheriff. And the sheriff, a practical man named Donald Pierce, who'd held his position for 12 years, decided it might be worth taking a drive out to the Haney farm himself. But when Sheriff Pierce arrived on December 22nd, the property was deserted. The house was locked up tight. The barn was empty except for some old equipment, and the pig pen, which had apparently housed over 30 animals just days before, was completely vacant. Ray Haney had vanished, and with him, any answers about what had happened to his 4 children. In the weeks that followed, as Christmas came and went, and 1941 gave way to 1942, the people of Ray County began to ask questions they should have asked years earlier. They began to remember things they'd chosen to forget. The bruises on Bonnie Haney's arms. The way the children had become quieter and more withdrawn each year. The strange sounds that sometimes drifted across the frozen fields from the Haney property late at night. And they began to wonder about the pigs. Those huge, well-fed pigs that Ray Haney raised with such care. Pigs that seemed to grow larger and more numerous every year, despite the fact that Ray rarely sold them and never seemed to purchase enough feed to sustain such a large operation. The investigation had only just begun. But already, a terrible suspicion was taking root in the minds of everyone who'd known the Haney family. A suspicion so dark, so unthinkable, that most people refused to speak it aloud. Where were the Haney children? And what, exactly, had Ray Haney been feeding to his pigs? The truth was buried somewhere in the frozen earth of Ray County, waiting to be uncovered. But some secrets, once revealed, can never be forgotten. And some questions, once asked, demand answers, no matter how horrifying those answers might be. Sheriff Donald Pierce was not a man easily disturbed. In 12 years of law enforcement in Ray County, he'd seen his share of darkness, barroom stabbings, domestic disputes that ended in tragedy, a farmer who'd hanged himself in his own barn during the Depression. But as he stood in the empty yard of the Haney farm on the morning of December 23, 1941, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine dread. The property was silent, unnaturally so. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move through this place, as if nature itself wanted nothing to do with what had happened here. Pierce was 43 years old, a tall man with graying hair and a face that had learned not to show emotion. He'd brought his deputy, a young man named Thomas Garrett, barely 25, and still green enough to believe that law enforcement was about justice rather than managing the darkness that lived in men's hearts. "Sheriff," Thomas called from near the pig pen. His voice was tight, strained. "You need to see this." Pierce walked across the frozen ground, his boots crunching on frost. The pig pen was large, larger than it had any right to be for a small family farm. The fence was built from rough timber, and the ground inside was churned mud, now frozen solid. But it was empty, completely empty. "Where are the pigs?" Thomas asked. "Mrs. Calder said there were at least 30 of them just last week." Pierce didn't answer. He was looking at something else. Dark stains in the frozen mud, patterns that suggested something had been dragged across the ground. Multiple somethings. And the smell, even in the bitter cold, even with the pen abandoned, there was still a lingering odor that made his stomach turn. "Check the barn," Pierce said quietly. "I'm going into the house." The front door wasn't locked. Pierce pushed it open slowly, the hinges screaming in protest. The sound echoed through the empty house like a warning. The interior was dim, cold, and in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned in the front room. Dishes lay shattered on the kitchen floor. A calendar on the wall was still turned to November, the pages curled and water-damaged. The 15th was circled in pencil. No notation, just a circle. Pierce moved through the rooms methodically, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, more out of habit than any real expectation of danger. Whatever had happened here was long over. The kitchen was the worst. The table was covered in a dark substance that had dried and cracked. The sink was stained with something Pierce didn't want to identify. Flies, impossibly in this cold, still buzzed around the window, sluggish and dying. On the counter, he found a notebook. Ray Haney's handwriting, crude and angular. Most of it was mundane, records of feed purchases, notes about livestock. But toward the end, the entries became strange. November 10th. They won't stop crying. Can't work. Can't think. November 12th. Decided. No other way. November 14th. Made preparations. Pigs are ready. November 15th. It's done. God forgive me. But they're quieter now. Pierce felt his blood run cold. He carefully tore out the pages and folded them into his coat pocket. Upstairs, the children's bedrooms told a story of hasty abandonment, or something worse. Clothes were scattered across the floors. Beds were unmade. In what appeared to be Betty's room, Pierce found a small diary hidden under a loose floorboard. The entries were sporadic, written in a young girl's careful hand. October 3rd. Papa didn't come home until late. He smells like whiskey again. Lorene talked back at dinner. He locked her in the cellar. October 18th. James won't stop crying at night. He says he sees Mama in the hallway. Papa says if he doesn't shut up, he'll give him something to cry about. November 8th. I'm scared. Papa looks at us different now, like we're not his children anymore, like we're something else, something he needs to get rid of. November 13th. This is my last entry. If anyone finds this, please know we tried to be good. We tried so hard. But Papa says we're too much trouble. He says... The entry ended abruptly. The rest of the page was blank. Sheriff! Thomas's voice came from outside, urgent and panicked. Sheriff, you need to come here. Now! Pierce descended the stairs 2 at a time and ran out to the barn, where Thomas stood near a wooden door set into the ground, the entrance to a root cellar. The deputy's face was pale, his hands shaking. I found it unlocked, Thomas said. I went down to look and... Jesus Christ, Sheriff, there's blood everywhere. Pierce lit a kerosene lamp and descended the narrow stairs into the cellar. The smell hit him immediately. Copper and decay and something worse, something that spoke of terrible violence in an enclosed space. The cellar was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with earthen walls and a dirt floor. And Thomas was right. There was blood. Dried, dark, covering the floor in pools and spatters that climbed the walls. Too much blood for one person. Far too much. In the corner, Pierce found a pile of clothing. Children's clothing. A girl's dress, torn and stained. A boy's shirt with buttons ripped off, small shoes, and bones. Small bones that Pierce didn't want to examine too closely, but knew he would have to. He stood there in the lamplight, breathing through his mouth to avoid the smell, and felt the full weight of what he was looking at settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Get back to town, he told Thomas, his voice barely above a whisper. Call the state police. Tell them we need investigators, a coroner, and as many men as they can spare. Tell them. He paused, trying to find words for the unspeakable. Tell them we've found something bad. Real bad. While Pierce waited for the state police to arrive, he drove to the neighboring property to speak with Ruth Calder again. Ruth was a widow in her 60s who'd lived on her farm alone since her husband died 5 years earlier. She was known as a God-fearing woman who kept to herself and didn't gossip, which made her observations all the more credible. She met Pierce at her door, her face drawn and anxious. She'd been expecting this visit. I should have said something sooner, she told him, wringing her hands. I should have done something. But you don't want to believe the worst about your neighbors, do you? You tell yourself there's got to be another explanation. Pierce sat with her at her kitchen table while she made coffee neither of them would drink. Tell me about the screaming, he said gently. Ruth closed her eyes. It was November 15th. I remember because it was a Friday, and I'd been to town that morning to get supplies. I came home around supper time, and that's when I heard it. High-pitched screaming coming from the Haney place. At first I thought maybe an animal was hurt. Sometimes pigs will scream like that when they're in distress. But it didn't sound like pigs. No. Her voice was barely audible. No, it didn't. It sounded like children. It sounded like children screaming for help. And it went on for hours, Sheriff. Hours. And then around midnight, it just stopped. Complete silence. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat by my window, watching the lights in the Haney house. They stayed on until dawn. Did you see Ray Haney? I saw him the next morning. He was out by the pig pen, and he was— She paused, struggling with the memory. He was feeding the pigs, carrying buckets out to them. And the pigs, Sheriff, I've never seen pigs behave that way. They were frenzied, fighting each other to get to whatever he was feeding them. Pierce felt sick. What happened after that? He went about his business like nothing had happened. Worked around the farm for a few days. Then, maybe a week later, I saw him loading his truck in the middle of the night. Big bundles, wrapped in canvas. He made 3 trips, drove off somewhere and came back hours later with an empty truck. The next morning, the pigs were gone. All of them. Just vanished. And a day after that, Ray was gone too. Do you have any idea where he might have gone? Ruth shook her head. But Sheriff, there's one more thing. That night, the night I heard the screaming, I saw Betty, the oldest girl. She was standing in the upstairs window, just standing there with her hands pressed against the glass. And she was— Ruth's voice broke. She was mouthing something, over and over. I think she was saying, "Help us." But I was too far away to be sure. And by the time I thought about going over there, the screaming had stopped. And I told myself I'd imagined it all. Tears ran down her weathered face. I didn't imagine it, did I? No, ma'am, Pierce said quietly. I don't believe you did. The state police arrived the next day, Christmas Eve, with a team of investigators and a medical examiner from the state capitol. What they found in and around the Haney property would make headlines across the country and haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. In the cellar, they found extensive evidence of violence. The blood analysis would later confirm it belonged to at least 4 different individuals, all with blood types consistent with the Haney children. The bones were sent to the state laboratory for analysis, but it was what they found buried near the pig pen that confirmed everyone's worst fears. 3 feet down in the frozen earth, they discovered a mass grave containing dozens of bones, human bones that had been partially crushed and gnawed. The medical examiner, a man named Dr. Harrison, who'd seen combat in the Great War and thought nothing could shock him anymore, had to stop his examination twice to compose himself. The bones show evidence of having been fed to animals, he reported to Pierce and the state investigators. Pigs, most likely. Some of the bones are from adults, possibly Mrs. Haney, based on the estimated age and size, but most are from juveniles, children between the ages of 8 and 16. They found other things too. In the barn, hidden under a false floor, they discovered a saw and several butcher knives, all recently cleaned but still showing traces of blood in the handle grooves. They found Ray Haney's financial records, which showed he'd been selling pork to various buyers throughout the region for the past 3 years, far more pork than his property should have been able to produce. And they found photographs, family photos that showed the Haney children growing thinner and more hollow-eyed with each passing year. And in the most recent photos, taken just weeks before they disappeared, there was something else in their eyes, a terrible knowledge, a desperate plea that the camera had captured, but no one had been there to see. By December 26th, a massive manhunt was underway across 3 states. Ray Haney's description was circulated to every law enforcement agency in the Midwest. The FBI was called in. Newspapers across the country ran the story with headlines that screamed of horror and atrocity. Father suspected of feeding children to pigs. Missouri farm becomes chamber of horrors. 4 children missing in grisly case. Tips poured in from everywhere. Ray Haney was spotted in Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee. Every sighting was investigated, every lead pursued. But Ray Haney seemed to have vanished as completely as his children. Sheriff Pierce barely slept. He coordinated with state and federal authorities, conducted interviews, and pursued every possible lead. But at night, when he finally returned home to his own family, he couldn't stop thinking about those children. About Betty standing at the window, silently pleading for help that never came. About little James, who'd been afraid of the dark and hummed his mother's hymns. About Loreen's defiant spirit and Ray Jr.'s haunted eyes. They'd been real children with real lives, and something unspeakable had been done to them in that farmhouse while the world went about its business, oblivious. The question that haunted everyone wasn't just what had happened to the Haney children. The evidence made that horrifyingly clear. The question was, where was Ray Haney now? And perhaps more terrifying, if he'd done this once, what was to stop him from doing it again? The investigation had uncovered a nightmare beyond imagination. But the monster who'd created that nightmare was still out there, somewhere in the vast American landscape. And as 1942 began, as America threw itself into war overseas, a different kind of war was being waged at home, a desperate race to find Ray Haney before he could disappear forever, taking his terrible secrets with him into the darkness. January 1942 brought bitter cold and a growing sense of frustration to the investigators hunting Ray Haney. It had been 3 weeks since the discovery at the Haney farm, and despite hundreds of tips and reported sightings, the man had vanished like smoke. FBI agent Marcus Thornton had been assigned to the case from the agency's Kansas City office. At 38, Thornton was considered one of the Bureau's best manhunters, a tall, methodical man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. He'd tracked bootleggers during Prohibition and bank robbers during the Depression. But Ray Haney was proving to be a different kind of quarry altogether. Thornton set up operations in the Ray County Courthouse, converting a second-floor courtroom into a makeshift command center. Maps covered the walls, each one marked with pins representing reported sightings, known associates, and possible destinations. Red string connected various points, creating a web of possibilities that grew more complex by the day. Sheriff Pierce worked alongside him, along with Deputy Thomas Garrett, and a rotating team of state police investigators. The room smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from hunting monsters. "He's smart," Thornton said one evening, staring at the maps. "Smarter than we gave him credit for. Look at the pattern. Every confirmed sighting puts him moving in a different direction. St. Louis, then Tulsa, then back north toward Des Moines. He's doubling back, creating false trails." "Or the sightings are wrong," Pierce suggested. Half the men in 3 states fit Haney's general description. Middle-aged, weathered work clothes. He could be anyone. "No." Thornton shook his head. "Some of these are real. I can feel it. He's out there, and he's watching us chase our tails." What they didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that Ray Haney was much closer than anyone suspected. While the manhunt continued, investigators began digging into Ray Haney's past. And what they found painted a disturbing picture of a man who'd been heading toward this moment for most of his life. Thornton sent agents to Iowa, where the Haney family had lived before moving to Missouri. What they discovered there sent a chill through everyone involved in the case. In 1923, Ray and Bonnie Haney had lived on a small farm outside Cedar Rapids with their first 3 children. Betty, Loreen, and Ray Jr. had all been born in Iowa. They'd also had 2 other children, twins, a boy and girl, born in 1921. Those twins had died in 1923, just before the family's sudden move to Missouri. The official cause of death was listed as influenza, but the local doctor who'd signed the death certificates, now retired and living in a nursing home, remembered the case with disturbing clarity. "I never believed it was influenza," Dr. William Kowalski told the FBI agents who interviewed him. His hands shook as he spoke. Whether from age or the memory, it was hard to say. Those children were malnourished, severely so. And there were marks on their bodies, bruises, old fractures that had healed poorly. I reported my suspicions to the sheriff at the time, but nothing came of it. Ray Haney claimed they'd been sick for months, that he'd done everything he could, and Bonnie, his wife, she backed up everything he said. Wouldn't look me in the eye, but she confirmed his story. "What happened to the bodies?" the agents asked. Dr. Kowalski's face darkened. That was the strangest part. Haney insisted on burying them on his property immediately. Claimed it was for religious reasons. The sheriff allowed it. Within 2 weeks, the Haney family had packed up and left Iowa, sold the farm at a loss and disappeared. I tried to follow up, tried to push for an investigation, but I was just a country doctor. No one listened. The agents went to the old Haney farm in Iowa, now owned by a different family. With permission, they excavated the area where the twins had reportedly been buried. They found animal bones, pig bones, but no human remains. Back in Missouri, Thornton received a telegram that would change everything. A woman named Sarah Clemens, living in a boarding house in Little Rock, Arkansas, had contacted the local police claiming she had information about Ray Haney. Thornton and Pierce drove through the night to get there. Sarah Clemens was 52 years old, a thin woman with nervous eyes and hands that couldn't stay still. She met them in the parlor of the boarding house, her landlady hovering protectively nearby. "I knew I had to come forward," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw his picture in the newspaper, I couldn't stay silent anymore, not after all these years." "How do you know Ray Haney, Mrs. Clemens?" Thornton asked gently. "It's Miss Clemens. I never married." She took a deep breath. "I was engaged to Ray Haney's brother, Thomas, back in 1915. We lived in Iowa then, same town as the Haney family. Thomas and I were planning to marry that summer." "What happened?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas disappeared, just vanished one day in May. The police investigated, but they never found anything. Everyone assumed he'd gotten cold feet and run off. But I knew Thomas. He wouldn't have done that. He loved me. He was excited about our life together." "You think Ray had something to do with his brother's disappearance?" "I know he did." Her voice was stronger now. "Thomas told me things about Ray, about how violent he was, even as a child, about how their family's livestock would disappear, and how Ray always had an explanation, about how their father was afraid of his own son. Thomas said Ray wasn't right in the head, that there was something missing in him that made him human." She pulled out a worn photograph from her purse. It showed 2 young men standing in front of a barn. One was smiling. That would be Thomas. The other stood slightly apart, his face expressionless, his eyes cold even in the faded photograph. That was Ray. The last time I saw Thomas alive, he told me he'd confronted Ray about something. He wouldn't tell me what, said he needed to be sure first. 2 days later, he was gone. And Ray acted like nothing had happened. Helped search for his own brother with that blank look on his face, like he was watching a mildly interesting play. "Did you tell the police this at the time?" "I tried. They said I was being hysterical, letting grief cloud my judgment. Ray had an alibi. He'd been working at a meatpacking plant in town the day Thomas disappeared. Several people vouched for him. It wasn't until years later that I learned Ray had paid those men to lie for him. One of them, drunk and dying in a charity hospital, confessed it to a priest." Thornton leaned forward. "Miss Clemens, this is important. Based on what you knew of Ray Haney, where do you think he might go? Where would he feel safe?" She thought for a long moment. "Thomas once told me about a place the Haney family used to vacation when the boys were young. A cabin on a lake in the Ozarks, somewhere remote. Their family owned it, but after their parents died, it was abandoned. Thomas said Ray loved it there, said it was the only place Ray seemed almost happy. He called it his kingdom, a place where no one could bother him, where he could do whatever he wanted." "Do you remember where this cabin was?" "No, but Thomas mentioned it was near a town called Timber Creek. That's all I know." Timber Creek, Missouri, was barely a town at all, more of a crossroads with a general store, a gas station, and maybe 30 permanent residents. It sat in the heart of the Ozark Mountains, surrounded by dense forest and dozens of small lakes that dotted the landscape like scattered coins. Thornton, Pierce, and a team of 6 federal agents arrived on January 18th. The local constable, an elderly man named Horace Webb, confirmed that there were indeed several abandoned properties in the surrounding wilderness. including some old cabins that dated back to the previous century. Could be 20, 30 places like that within a 50-mile radius, Webb told them. Most of them are inaccessible except on foot or horseback, especially this time of year. Snow's been heavy in the high country. We need to check everyone, Thornton said. They spent 3 days searching. The work was brutal, hiking through deep snow, breaking into abandoned cabins, finding nothing but animal droppings and rotted furniture. The agents were exhausted, frostbitten, and beginning to doubt the lead. It was Deputy Garrett who found it. On the third day, searching alone along the shore of a small lake, he spotted smoke. Just a thin wisp rising from beyond a stand of pine trees. It could have been anything. A trapper's camp, lost hikers, locals who'd come out for winter hunting. But something made Garrett's instincts fire. He marked the location and hiked back to alert the others. They approached at dawn, moving through the forest as quietly as armed men can move through snow and dead leaves. 8 of them in total, spread out in a loose perimeter around the cabin that sat alone on the lake's edge. It was a small structure, logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney from which a thin stream of smoke rose into the gray morning sky. A single window facing the lake, covered from the inside with what looked like a blanket. No vehicles visible, but tracks in the snow suggested someone had been moving between the cabin and the lake regularly. Thornton signaled for everyone to hold position. They waited, watching, as the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose slightly. Inside the cabin, a shadow moved past the window. Someone was definitely inside. Thornton cupped his hands around his mouth. "Ray Haney, this is the FBI. The cabin is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Silence. Then, after a long moment, a voice from inside. Flat, empty. The voice of a man who'd known this moment would come eventually. "How'd you find me?" "Doesn't matter, Ray. It's over. Come out peacefully, and no one gets hurt." Another long pause. Then, "You don't understand. You can't understand what it was like, what they were like." "Then tell us, Ray. Help us understand. But you need to come out first." They wouldn't stop crying. After Bonnie died, they never stopped. Every day, crying and complaining and needing things. I couldn't think, couldn't work. They were draining everything from me, like parasites. Pierce felt sick listening to this. These were the words of a man trying to justify the unjustifiable. "Ray, we know about your children. We know about Bonnie. We know about your brother Thomas. We know everything. This is your chance to tell your side of the story, but you need to come out now." "There is no story." The voice was rising now, taking on an edge of hysteria. "There's only what had to be done. They were my children, mine. I gave them life, and I had the right to take it back when they became too much trouble. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." Thornton exchanged glances with Pierce. The man was completely delusional, lost in some twisted logic that only existed in his own mind. "Last chance, Ray. Come out now, or we're coming in." The response was a sound no one expected. Laughter. High, brittle, the laugh of a man who'd already left reality behind. "You think I'm afraid of you? You think I'm afraid of what you'll do to me? I'm not afraid of anything anymore. I'm free, finally, free." And then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but would be replayed in the minds of everyone present for the rest of their lives. The cabin door burst open, and Ray Haney emerged, not with his hands up, but with a shotgun raised. He was exactly as the descriptions had portrayed him, weathered, heavy-built, wearing filthy overalls. But his eyes were what stopped everyone cold. They were the eyes of someone who'd stepped beyond humanity, into some realm where normal rules no longer applied. He was screaming, a wordless animal sound, as he raised the weapon. Multiple gunshots rang out simultaneously. Ray Haney jerked backward, the shotgun firing harmlessly into the air, and collapsed in the snow. The agents approached carefully, weapons still raised, but it was clear Ray Haney was beyond any earthly judgment. He lay on his back, blood spreading around him in a dark halo, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the gray sky above. In his final moments, as the agents would later report, his lips moved. One of the agents claimed he was saying mine, mine, mine over and over, but in such a whisper that it was impossible to be certain. Ray Haney died there in the snow, 30 feet from the cabin where he'd been hiding, taking his secrets and his madness with him. Inside the cabin, investigators found evidence that confirmed Ray Haney had been living there for nearly a month. He had supplies, a makeshift bed, and, most disturbing, a journal. The journal entries were rambling, often incoherent, but they provided a glimpse into the mind of a man who'd been spiraling into darkness for decades. He wrote about feeling empty inside, about how even as a child he'd known he was different from other people. He wrote about his brother Thomas, who'd discovered Ray had been harming animals and threatened to expose him. He wrote about Bonnie, who'd slowly realized what she'd married and had tried, in her final years, to protect her children from their own father. And he wrote about the children, not with remorse, but with resentment. He described them as burdens, as things that consumed his resources and gave nothing back. The final entries, written just days before his discovery, were the most chilling. They're still in my head, still crying, even now. I can hear them every night. Betty begging, Lorene fighting, Ray Jr. too scared to make a sound, and James screaming for his mama. But I did what needed to be done. I always do what needs to be done. That's what they could never understand. That's what no one ever understood. The journal was entered into evidence, though portions of it were deemed too disturbing to release to the public. Ray Haney was dead, but the horror he'd created would live on. For the people of Ray County, for the investigators who'd hunted him, and most of all, for the memory of 4 children who'd cried out for help that came too late. The physical hunt was over, but the real questions, how could this have happened? Could it have been stopped? Those questions would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The death of Ray Haney on January 21, 1942, brought an end to the manhunt, but it was far from the end of the investigation. If anything, his death only deepened the mystery. Without a confession, without his testimony, the full truth of what happened to the Haney children would have to be pieced together from evidence, forensics, and the fragments of horror he'd left behind. Agent Marcus Thornton remained in Ray County for another 3 months, overseeing the painstaking work of documenting everything. The cabin in the Ozarks was searched inch by inch. The Haney farm was excavated further. And slowly, terribly, the complete picture began to emerge. Dr. Harrison, the medical examiner, worked with a team of forensic specialists from the State University. His final report, submitted in March 1942, was clinical in its language, but devastating in its conclusions. The bones found buried near the pig pen belonged to at least 6 individuals, 4 children matching the ages and descriptions of the Haney children, 1 adult female consistent with Bonnie Haney, and 1 adult male whose identity was never definitively established, but was believed to be Thomas Haney, Ray's brother who disappeared in 1915. The remains show evidence of extreme trauma, Dr. Harrison wrote in his report. Multiple fractures, evidence of blunt force injuries, and, most significantly, signs of having been consumed by animals, specifically pigs. Based on the condition and distribution of the remains, I believe the victims were deceased before being fed to the animals. However, I cannot state this with absolute certainty. That final sentence haunted everyone who read it. The possibility, however remote, that any of the Haney children might have still been alive when they were given to the pigs was too horrible to contemplate. Thornton ordered that portion of the report sealed. The public would never need to know that particular detail. Of all the evidence collected, it was Betty Haney's diary that provided the most heartbreaking insight into the final days of the children's lives. Thornton had found it hidden under the floorboard in her room, and he'd read it cover to cover a dozen times, each reading more difficult than the last. Betty had started the diary in January 1941, just after her 16th birthday. The early entries were typical teenage observations, complaints about chores, mentions of boys at school, little arguments with her siblings. But as the year progressed, a darker tone emerged. March 14th, 1941. Papa is drinking more. He came home last night and broke all of Mama's good dishes. Said they reminded him of her, and he couldn't stand to look at them anymore. Lorene tried to clean it up and cut her hand. Papa didn't even notice. June the 2nd, 1941. I think Papa is going crazy. He talks to himself now, especially at night. I can hear him in his room, having whole conversations with people who aren't there. Sometimes he calls out Mama's name. Sometimes he says things I can't understand. I'm scared. August 23rd, 1941. Papa told us today that we're too expensive to keep. He said we eat too much, cost too much, demand too much. He said he's been thinking about solutions. When I asked what he meant, he just looked at me with those empty eyes and said, "You'll see." October 30th, 1941. The pigs are acting strange. Papa has been feeding them different things. I don't know what, but the smell is terrible, and there are so many of them now. Where did they all come from? Papa spends all his time with them, talking to them like they're his real children. November 10th, 1941. Papa locked Ray Jr. in the cellar for 2 days because he dropped a bucket of feed. No food, no water. When he finally let him out, Ray Jr. wouldn't talk to any of us. He just sat in the corner and stared at nothing. I don't know what Papa did to him down there, but Ray Jr. is different now. Broken. November 14th, 1941. This is my last entry. If anyone finds this, please know we tried to be good. We tried so hard. But Papa says we're too much trouble. He says the pigs are hungry and we've finally become useful. I don't understand what he means, but I'm so scared. I can hear him sharpening knives in the kitchen. He's been drinking all day and muttering about taking care of the problem. I tried to run with the others, but he caught us. He locked all the doors. We can't get out. James won't stop crying. Lorene is trying to break a window, but they're all nailed shut. I think Papa is coming upstairs now. I can hear his footsteps. Dear God, please. The entry ended there, the pencil trailing off the page. Sheriff Pierce had been present when Thornton first read the diary aloud to the investigative team. 3 grown men, hardened law enforcement officers, had wept openly in that room. Through careful analysis of all the evidence, the diary entries, Ruth Calder's testimony, Ray Haney's own journal, and the forensic evidence, investigators were able to piece together the likely sequence of events on November 15th, 1941. Ray Haney, spiraling deeper into alcoholism and mental illness after his wife's death, had become increasingly resentful of his children. Financial pressures, the isolation of farm life, and his own deteriorating mental state had created a perfect storm of rage and delusion. On the evening of November 14th, he'd made his decision. The children had tried to escape, but Haney had secured all the exits. He'd herded them into the cellar, that cold, dark space that would become their tomb. What happened in that cellar over the next several hours was something investigators could only speculate about based on the physical evidence. The screaming that Ruth Calder heard likely lasted from early evening until midnight. Then silence. By dawn on November 16th, Ray Haney was feeding his pigs. Witnesses reported seeing him make multiple trips from the cellar to the pig pen, carrying large wrapped bundles. The pigs, which had been deliberately starved for several days, consumed whatever he gave them with the violent efficiency that only truly hungry animals possess. Over the next week, Haney had disposed of the remaining evidence, the bones that the pigs couldn't consume, the blood-soaked materials from the cellar, any trace of his children's existence. He'd sold the pigs quickly, to multiple buyers across 3 states, making sure no single person acquired too many. Then he'd fled, knowing that eventually someone would ask questions. The plan had almost worked. If Martha Henderson had waited even 1 more week to check on the children, if Ruth Calder hadn't reported the screaming, if Sheriff Pierce hadn't been as thorough as he was, Ray Haney might have disappeared completely, leaving behind only questions and suspicions but no proof. The Haney case changed Ray County in ways both visible and invisible. The farm itself was burned to the ground in February 1942, with the full approval of county authorities. No one wanted the property to stand as a monument to what had happened there. The land was eventually sold to a developer who turned it into a small residential area, though even today locals avoid discussing its history. Sheriff Donald Pierce served in his position for another 15 years, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same after the Haney case. He became more protective of children in the community, more vigilant about signs of trouble in families. He investigated every report of potential wrongdoing, no matter how minor, with the same thorough intensity he'd brought to the Haney investigation. Deputy Thomas Garrett left law enforcement entirely 6 months after Ray Haney's death. He moved to California and became a school teacher, dedicating his life to protecting and educating children. In interviews late in his life, he spoke about how the case had fundamentally changed his understanding of evil. "Before the Haney case, I thought evil was something dramatic," he said in a 1978 interview. "I thought it was bank robbers and murderers who looked like monsters. But Ray Haney taught me that evil often looks ordinary. It wears overalls and goes to church and waves to its neighbors. The scariest monsters are the ones you don't recognize until it's too late." Agent Marcus Thornton went on to have a distinguished career with the FBI, eventually becoming a specialist in cases involving crimes against children. But he kept a photograph in his desk drawer for the rest of his career, a picture of the 4 Haney children, taken at school in 1940. Betty with her nervous smile, Lorene looking defiant even in a school photo, Ray Jr. serious and watchful, and little James with that gap-toothed grin. "I keep it to remind me why the work matters," he told a colleague once. "Those children deserve to grow up. They deserve to have lives. Every child deserves that. And when we fail to protect them, when we miss the signs or ignore the warnings, this is what can happen." The Haney case became one of the most notorious criminal cases of the 1940s, mentioned in psychology textbooks and criminal justice courses as an example of how family isolation, mental illness, and societal blindness can create conditions for unspeakable tragedy. It led to changes in how authorities handled welfare checks on children. Missouri implemented new requirements for school attendance tracking and mandatory reporting of prolonged absences. Social workers were given more authority to investigate families where children might be at risk. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was simply this. It reminded a nation caught up in a world war that monsters existed on the home front too, and that the price of ignoring the signs of domestic violence and child endangerment could be measured in young lives destroyed. The graves of the 4 Haney children were eventually established in the Ray County Cemetery, not far from where their mother Bonnie was buried. The headstones are simple. Betty Haney, 1925, 1941, Forever Young Lorene Haney, 1927, 1941, never forgotten. Ray Haney Jeter, 1929, 1941, at peace now. James Haney, 1933, 1941, beloved child. Every year, even now, more than 8 decades later, someone leaves flowers at those graves. Sometimes it's descendants of the investigators who worked the case. Sometimes it's local residents who've learned the story and want to ensure the children are remembered. Sometimes it's people from far away who've read about the case and traveled to Ray County to pay their respects. The flowers are never the same, but the message they carry is always identical. You mattered. You were loved. You are not forgotten. Despite the thorough investigation, despite the evidence collected and the conclusions drawn, some questions about the Haney case remain unanswered. What happened to the pigs? Ray Haney had sold them to various buyers across 3 states in the week after the murders. Most were likely processed for meat within weeks of purchase. Did anyone unknowingly consume pork from animals that had been fed human remains? It's a question that haunted investigators, but one that could never be fully answered. The buyers were tracked down and informed, but by then, it was too late to trace what had happened to the animals. Were there other victims? Ray Haney's journal hinted at violence that stretched back decades. The twins who died in Iowa under suspicious circumstances. His brother Thomas, whose remains were likely among those found at the farm. Were there others? Travelers who'd stopped at the farm, hired hands who'd disappeared, people whose absence had never been properly investigated? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. Ray Haney took those secrets to his grave. And what about Bonnie Haney? The evidence suggested she'd been another of Ray's victims, but had she also been complicit in earlier crimes? Dr. Kowalski's testimony about the twins suggested she'd supported Ray's lies. Had she been a victim herself, terrified into silence? Or had she been something more complicated, a woman caught between fear of her husband and fear of what might happen if she spoke up? These questions linger like ghosts, reminders that even the most thoroughly investigated cases have shadows that never quite resolve into light. The Haney case serves as a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting our failures and our fears. It asks uncomfortable questions about how much we're willing to see, how much we're willing to intervene, and what price we're willing to pay for minding our own business. Ruth Calder heard screaming and waited. Martha Henderson noticed the children's absence and almost didn't investigate. Dr. Kowalski in Iowa saw signs of wrongdoing and was ignored. How many people saw something wrong with the Haney family over the years but told themselves it wasn't their place to interfere? The case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it happens quietly, behind closed doors, in isolated farmhouses where no one thinks to look. Sometimes it wears a familiar face and speaks in a neighbor's voice. And it reminds us that children, vulnerable, dependent, trusting, rely on adults to protect them. When we fail in that duty, when we look away or convince ourselves that everything is probably fine, we become complicit in whatever happens next. The Haney children never had a chance. They were born into a family with a violent, disturbed father and isolated from the help they desperately needed. They tried to be good. Betty wrote in her diary about trying so hard to be good. But in the end, it didn't matter, because they were trapped with a monster who saw them not as children, but as problems to be solved. Their story is a tragedy, but it's also a warning. On a cold December morning in 2024, a historian visiting the Ray County Cemetery photographed the Haney children's graves for a book about Missouri's most notorious crimes. As she stood there, reading the simple inscriptions, an elderly woman approached carrying fresh flowers. "Did you know them?" the historian asked. "No," the woman replied, kneeling to place the flowers by James's headstone. "I'm not from here. I'm from California, actually. But I had children of my own once. And when I read about what happened to these kids, I needed to come. I needed them to know that someone still cares." She stood, wiping tears from her eyes. We can't change what happened to them, but we can remember. We can make sure their story isn't forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn to see the warning signs earlier, to speak up sooner, to protect the children who need us now. She walked away, leaving the historian alone with the graves and the weight of history. The wind moved through the bare trees of the cemetery, carrying with it the whisper of old sorrows and timeless warnings. Somewhere, in countless homes across America and around the world, there are children who need help. Children living with violence, with neglect, with monsters who hide behind ordinary faces. The Haney children can't be saved, but others still can. That is their legacy. That is their final gift to a world that failed them. Remember their names. Tell their story. And when you see signs that a child needs help, speak up, before it's too late. The end. This case remains one of the most disturbing examples of familial violence in American criminal history. While the investigation officially closed with Ray Haney's death in 1942, its impact continues to resonate in discussions about child welfare, domestic violence, and the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable among us. Betty, Lorene, Ray Jr., and James Haney were real children who deserved real lives. This story is dedicated to their memory and to all children who suffer in silence, hoping someone will hear their cries for help. May we all learn to listen better.